Good day. Now, for Lecture 8B, let's dig into some of the deeper and more controversial implications of the energy transition, where, as you'd expect, I have some analytic conclusions and some personal views that might surprise you. Let's start with a reminder of four basics of the energy transition now underway, assembled by my former RMI colleague, now at Ember, financial analyst Kingsmill Bond. First, renewables beat fossil fuels in every dimension. IEA's 2024 renewables report raised the 2030 renewable target by 5 percentage points. Second, exponential, not linear, is the new normal. So everyone needs to move fast. Models and thinking are linear, reality is exponential. So since about 2010, solar additions have averaged over 3 times what was expertly forecast just 5 years before. Third, China is setting the pace of the renewables race as the U.S. did with the internet, launching a competitive race to the top. And fourth, by 2030, the renewables race will be settled and obvious to all. Fossil fuels will have dropped off of their bumpy plateau into clear decline. Climate impacts will be highly visible. 4 technologies, PVs, wind, EVs, and their enabling batteries and heat pumps, in 4 markets, China, US, EU, and India, over the next 4 years, have set and will set the direction. However, some old technologies that failed in the marketplace have undertaken desperate, large-scale rearguard actions that distract attention, divert resources, and aim to slow the transition. And I'm not only talking about fossil fuels. Let's examine the most prominent example of what I just described, where, as you'll see, I have some views. Given the strong and bipartisan recent political rhetoric about nuclear power, currently driven around the world by a vast, skilled, and very successful influence campaign, you may be curious about its actual status and prospects, its potential role in climate protection, and its potential role in global development and security. Michael Schneider, the lead editor of the remarkable and meticulously documented annual World Nuclear Industry Status Report, free at worldnuclearreport.org, has kindly shared 14 graphs on nuclear power's global status and prospects, so I could use the most up-to-date data. The nuclear share of world electricity generation, the red line on the left, has fallen by nearly half to 9%. Nuclear output in purple has stagnated. Ember preliminarily estimates 2024 nuclear output at a 3% rise. On the right, the output growth is more than all in China, the yellow parts of the bars. In the rest of the world, it fell back to the level of the mid-1990s. World nuclear capacity, in red, is 1% above its previous peak in 2006, because the fewer but newer reactors tend to be larger. Not included in the 411 units shown here are 31, 19 of them in Japan, that are in long-term outage. Most have been out of service for 14 plus years, without clarity on whether or when they might resume operation. Mainly at the insistence of Japan, the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, long counted those plants as operational, but then abandoned this fiction in 2022 and retroactively adopted a similar suspended operation category. In 2024, this new convention added only 8 gigawatts to Schneider's total of operating plants in this graph. Now, in the past 20 years, 3 more reactors have been added in blue than were retired in brown worldwide. But that's only because China added 51. Outside China, the world started up 53 reactors but closed 101 for a net decrease of 48. Nearly half the reactors now under construction worldwide, 28 of 61, are in China, the yellow bars. Global nuclear construction is nearly all done by China at home or by Russia abroad. Essentially, all new nuclear projects worldwide are centrally planned rather than private market. Reactors now under construction are far fewer than in the 1970s, that big cluster of blue bars, and of those, 1 in 9 projects in gold didn't get finished. Now, it's hard to discern the widely proclaimed nuclear renaissance, especially outside China, with just 1 to 5 units started in each of the past 5 years. 3/5 of the world's construction starts, 2020 to 24, were in China, where the nuclear bureaucracy remains potent, although its targets are quietly shrinking. Despite complete government control, only 1 recent reactor in China in 2021 to 3 was connected to the grid on time. Global average nuclear construction took 10 years versus China's 6 and rising, with a range from 4 to 10 years. And yes, I did mean to imply that with that one Chinese exception, no recent reactor completion has been on time anywhere. Now, China's fleet averages just 11 years old, and only 1 unit is older than the world average. But the other main nuclear fleets are far older, and like people, they get a year older every year. Unlike people, though, intense radiation damages their materials and radioactivity complicates their maintenance. Operators do try to upgrade plants with newer components, like digital controls, but this is difficult and complex, and it cannot prevent the gradual deterioration of materials, massive metal vessels, pipes, heat exchangers, welds, and so on. Most national nuclear power fleets are over 30 years old, vertical scale on the left. The oldest reactor still operating in early 2025 is in Switzerland and is just over 60 years old. Many reactors originally designed to last 30 or 40 years have nonetheless won license extensions to 60 or 80 years. However, that extrapolation from experience may overstate their practical operating life, because old reactors, like old cars, tend to break more and cost more to fix. Through 2024, the world's 213 closed reactors averaged 28 years of operation. The majority closed before age 30. Only 1/5 of them lasted more than 40 years. The reactors that were closed from 2019 through 23 averaged 43 years old. So again, there's not much empirical basis for extending licenses to 60 or 80, and it may not reflect how long they actually end up running. Since most of the world's reactors were built in or before the 1970s, the IAEA expects 10 closures per average year from 2018 off the left end of this chart through 2050. Over the past decade, startups have averaged 6.7 units per year. So assuming all license extensions approved so far, and in other cases 40-year life, global nuclear capacity, as shown, should therefore shrink in all but 3 future years as closures outnumber new starts. So it's hard to imagine world nuclear output even holding steady, let alone rising. But already the technology is scarcely relevant. In China, nuclear output was surpassed by wind power starting in 2012, by solar power starting in 2022. In 2023, China connected 1.2 nuclear gigawatts to the grid, plus 293 gigawatts of solar and wind power, because they're faster and at half the cost. In 2024, China added 2.1 gigawatts of nuclear power, plus 357 gigawatts of solar and wind power. Globally, nuclear power in 2024 added 3.9 more gigawatts than it retired, but solar added 599 gigawatts and wind power added 131 gigawatts. So this 2 order of magnitude gap in deployment rate continues to expand for fundamental reasons. Normally, that would mean game over. Now, in France, with the world's second biggest nuclear fleet, the past few years' dramatic output slump illustrates the challenge. In 2022, corrosion, cracks, and other signs of aging, widespread across the relatively standardized designs, made nuclear power France's most intermittent power source. The French grid had to import heavily from Germany when more French nuclear capacity was offline than the total nuclear capacity Germany had phased out since 2000. Oddly, the French slump goes almost unmentioned while the German phase-out is heavily criticized. If the French nuclear fleet's shortfall from 2019 to 22, as you can see at the right side of this graph, were offset by combined cycle gas generation, reasonable assumption, it would have burned nearly twice as much gas as the spring 22 shortfall in total European gas storage that gave Putin such leverage. And the national utility, Électricité de France, cannot afford to modernize its 56 reactors, let alone replace or augment them. The biggest economy so far to abandon nuclear power is Germany, which simultaneously slashed fossil fuel generation as renewables in 2024 soared to 55% of electricity consumption, or 63% of net public supply. And electric efficiency rose to 55% more than in 1990. In 2024, Germany's coal and lignite generation was the lowest since 1957. You can see the evolution here with the cumulative since 2010 fossil generation going down. The reduction is in red. Nuclear going down in purple. And there was a slight increase in net imports just in the last couple of years. But meanwhile, consumption decreased in aqua and renewables soared in green. So that's how the books balance. Now, here's a more graphic version of what happened in Germany. Just as nuclear power in purple ended, generation from coal in black and lignite in brown continued to fall right through 2024 and still. Notice when you look at the more detailed data behind that chart, the especially steep decline in the black coal curve and the brown lignite curve from 22 to 24, even as the last reactors in purple closed forever in April 23. Claims that Germany had to burn more coal to replace shuttered nuclear plants are wrong, with or without counting international power trade. Germany was a net power exporter 2002 to 22. It became a net importer in 2023 and 4, mainly though that was renewable. The latest update from Ember shows that after the Greens entered the German government in 2021, coal-fired generation in black fell by over 30%. Renewable generation in green and aqua rose by nearly 30%, both just in 3 years, comparing the first half of 24 with the period 3 years earlier. And that's even as the nuclear phase-out agreed by national consensus in 2000, 2001, passed into German law in 2002, was finally completed in April 23 in aqua. In 2024 alone, renewable contracts were being issued that were equivalent to about 8% of total generation. At that rate, Germany could complete its coal-fired phase-out in 2028, 2 years early, unless the 2025 election alters energy policy. So, if you have heard, as our leading newspapers report, that Germany's Energiewende energy transition has failed, you have been duped. And likewise, if you're told about Germany's or Denmark's high household electricity prices, by long-standing policy, those prices in those countries are mostly taxes. Germany's electricity prices are quite normal for European average. But you would be in good company. Many of the world's leading journalists and energy experts have been misled by a steady, prolonged, effective, and continuing disinformation campaign focused on financial, business, and opinion leaders who generally don't read German or keep up with German data. The larger context here is Germany's impressive prolonged shrinkage of electricity use in gold, primary energy use in aqua, and emissions in green, despite the GDP real growth in red. Germany's CO2 emissions peaked in 1973, 34 years before the U.S. peaked. and the German emissions per capita are half as big as those in the United States. Now, a more nuanced but parallel story emerges in Japan. Ostensibly pro-renewable national policies have been ingeniously designed to suppress renewables, especially wind power, the most formidable competitor to legacy plants, and also to limit competition and support uneconomic thermal plants and their owners through a new capacity market. Fukushima Daiichi, on top of an earlier serious earthquake, caused all Japanese reactors to close for a couple of years, and ever since they have struggled to restart. Of all the reactors operating in, say, 2005, 27 have permanently closed. 14 were still operating as of February 25 at an average age of 38 years. 19 more units had not run for 10 to 14 years and remained in limbo as utilities' credibility and financial strength ebb. Japan's central government really wants to restart those idle reactors, but that's largely in the hands of the newly independent safety regulator, many prefectural governors, mayors, judges, and increasingly the marketplace. Fortunately, Japan's lost nuclear output, far from causing a huge rise in fossil fuel burning as often claimed, accompanied a net decrease, as you see on the left. Savings plus renewables more than offset the nuclear losses and can continue to, especially if the government, still enthralled to incumbent utilities, allows the real competition required by national law. Successive prime ministers seem to vary in their nuclear and renewable enthusiasms. Thus, the actual data of the German and Japanese experience have some short-term ambiguities now and then, but they really confirm the vibrancy, speed, and effectiveness of the combined efficiency and renewables revolutions, and their prospects if they continue to overcome entrenched incumbents and global disinformation. Now, in the United States, enthusiasts suggest that the $445 per megawatt hour levelized nominal cost of power from the recently completed pair of Vogtle nuclear units in Georgia, only 2 to be completed out of the vast nuclear renaissance proposed, that price of $445 could drop to $230 for a greenfield or $180 for a brownfield reactor. It seems optimistic, and no private investor has stepped up to validate it. All proposed U.S. reactors rely heavily on taxpayer funding. But if it occurred, Bloomberg's latest comparison says it would be several-fold costlier than a new gas plant with carbon capture or a hybrid wind or solar project firmed by battery storage. History also suggests that nuclear costs are likelier to keep rising even as renewable costs keep falling. Now, empirically confirming the message of this chart, Jim Lazar points out that in less than a year, 2024, investors in free market Texas added enough wind, solar, and storage to provide dispatchable service equivalent to both the Vogtle nuclear units, but at about half their $36 billion investment, a third their operating cost, and a decade and a half sooner. Many people seem to believe that only nuclear power can provide the exceptional reliability needed to run data centers. However, the average nuclear plant suffers unexpected outages about 3 weeks per year, 5.7% of the time. That's longer than the typical total 3.5% per year duration of the Dunkelflaute dark doldrums events in Germany. Big nuclear fleets can do even worse than individual plants because of single events that shut many reactors at once, like earthquake and tsunami in Japan. Or the French example you've seen from 2019 to 21, when repairs or safety checks closed over half the aging reactors, and steep drops in output persisted into 2024 at levels several times longer than the rare maximum wind lulls in the United Kingdom. Nuclear plants are also prone to derating or interruption by heat waves or droughts that affect their copious need of cooling water. So nuclear power, in sum, is hardly a reliable resource. Like every kind of electricity generator, each reactor sometimes fails, requiring adequate other arrangements like backup or firming, or the equivalent on the demand side. Now, since early 2024, sudden forecasts of an imminent return to electricity growth rates not seen for 4 decades have often been claimed to require new nuclear plants, especially so-called small modular reactors, which are supposedly faster. But those are not yet a thing. Claims of operation in a few years are not credible. Sales hype is not evidence. And the giant tech companies claim to have bought various new kinds of reactors have in general only expressed interest, not entered actual binding purchase contracts. Curiosity's cheap, reactors are expensive. A little history about the construction cost that dominates total nuclear cost. In contrast to the falling renewable costs we've seen, nuclear capital cost escalation and delay are the norm now and from the start of the industry. There are some claimed exceptions in Korea and China, but those data are unverifiable and often highly dubious. For the United States, each yellow point is a reactor, and their rise shows the historic fleet's pattern of rising real capital costs shown in what are called overnight terms, meaning if hypothetically you could build the plant overnight and incur no financing costs during construction and no escalation during construction. But actually, those factors do happen because you can't build overnight, it takes about a decade, and that doubled roughly the overnight cost to the actual cost not shown here. Now, the first few decades exhibited Cheop's law, that is, multiply the initial cost estimate by pi, or if it's high-tech, pi squared. On the right side of the graph, you see a bunch of different colored dots. Those show cost estimates underlying the campaign for a nuclear renaissance over a decade ago, which by 2022, before the Vogtle reactor staggered across the finish line, had cost over $40 billion without saving a single CO2 molecule. Now, these color-coded estimates vary by about fourfold along the vertical axis of cost, depending on who made the estimates. Academic, government, and nuclear industry advocates claim very low costs to be paid by others. Financial institutions and independent analysts, in contrast, found very high costs. Gradually, as sales pitches evolved into contractual negotiations with billions of actual dollars at risk, the bid costs converged to or above the upper estimates. This continues today in the few reactors still struggling across the finish line despite prodigious cost and time overruns and financial risks. What are those financial risks? Well, the British project's owner, Électricité de France, said in 2020 that its juicy guaranteed real payment for output, if and when that plant is finished, comprises 21% for operating costs, just 12% for overnight construction costs, which normally would be a dominant term, 28% for financing if this were a normally risky project, and 39% for this first-of-a-kind project's extra risk. In other words, the builder says there's over 3 times as much cost for unique financial risk as for actual construction. Remarkable. Yet Électricité de France will still lose billions on that project because they underbid the actual risk, which keeps rising. In short, nobody knows what new reactors will cost. That's why the promoters want someone else to take the risk. As when a startup called NewScale wanted to unload all of its cost overrun price and performance risk onto rural electric buyers who belatedly but wisely bailed out and the project collapsed. The British government has not yet done that sort of reassessment with the foundering Hinkley Point C plant EDF is building, as I just referred to, let alone its successor, which they're keen to build at Sizewell C, even though nobody wants to invest in it. Now, rising nuclear costs and slowing construction are not just an American and British issue. They're nearly worldwide. Claimed nuclear learning curves, the more you build, the cheaper they get, have long been claimed and assumed, but they have never been reliably observed in modern reactors, with a tiny exception. In the left graph, at the very left-hand end, the first few units of France's program in the late 70s could be said to have gotten cheaper with experience, but it was all uphill after that. Now, France has unique and remarkable institutional conditions. There's no enabling statute governing the world's most ambitious nuclear program. Everything is run by a uniquely cohesive technocratic group, the Corps des Mines, controlling every key energy policy lever in the central government. Full access to the public purse with no market discipline. Illegality of opposition to nuclear power. It's actually against the law in France. They can break your head. And until recently, little or no transparency or independent regulation or fair competition. It's starting to change a little bit very late. However, the latest reactor projects in France, Flamanville-3, and Finland, Olkiluoto 3, are around pi times the original cost and construction time. And I suspect that's largely because the French construction on an aggressive, steady rhythm actually overbuilt the French market. And then the predicted export market collapsed. So orders paused for 14 years, and a whole generation of construction managers retired, leaving successors too unseasoned to manage these supremely complex projects and supply chains deteriorated to deliver them. I give all credit to France's elite nuclear corps. They were bold, technically capable, and disciplined enough to stick to 4 main variants of a single broad reactor design. But the factors I've just outlined overwhelmed those advantages. And now the standardization needed to control costs also standardized failures that have lately crippled the 39-year-old fleet with metallurgical failures. And long suppressing alternatives was really bad for your career in France if you didn't favor nuclear power, has now restricted the government's other options, and I don't envy the position they back themselves into. You see, doing nuclear power well and safely is very, very hard. Admiral Hyman Rickover, the formidable, famously rigorous and demanding genius who created the U.S. nuclear Navy and its exacting technical culture, wrote these trenchant comments about the difference between theoretical reactors in the top paragraph and actual reactors in the bottom paragraph. He was right in every respect. His insights are being reproven weekly in the current wave of efforts to create new or rediscover old kinds of reactors. I may have mentioned how Admiral Rickover ensured top-quality hull welds on the first U.S. nuclear submarines. He just told the welders and their CEOs they'd all be aboard for the maiden dive, and that worked. But unfortunately, it does not deter today's reactors' promoters because so much of the investment is to come from taxpayers. That's why we now have startups that have never built a reactor. They don't even seem capable of submitting a license application adequate for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to consider, despite every pressure on the Commission to streamline and cut corners. Now, with that background, let me survey 3 issues today. The first 2 are about nuclear power's role in climate change and in nuclear proliferation, that is, the spread of nuclear weapons to nations or others that now lack them. It was obvious even in the 1960s that we must avoid both of these two existential risks to civilization and be especially careful not to trade off one threat for the other. So for 40 years, I tried to point out profitable ways to solve both and the oil problem too, but I failed. Nuclear power's grip on national and international policy was and still is too strong. So through a combination of inattention, some well-intentioned stupidity, and increasing venality and corruption, we now have both these threats, and we must play the hand we have dealt ourselves. You already know at least the main parts, the energy parts of how to stabilize climate. So now let's address the other threat and broadly explore a possible way, the only way so far devised that seems logically tight and internally consistent, to tackle proliferation. Then I'll add some thoughts about how to build global security. So to start examining nuclear power and climate protection, let's ask, how should we compare different ways to provide electrical services? You see, we built coal-fired power plants by counting cost but not carbon. Nuclear advocates defend their option by counting carbon but not cost. But to protect the climate, we must save the most carbon at the least cost and in the least time. That means counting all three variables, carbon and cost and time. Costly or slow options save less carbon per dollar or per year than cheaper or faster options. Thus, even a low or no carbon option that is too costly or too slow will reduce and retard achievable climate protection. I posted a simple way to compare climate effectiveness using market data. Now, many analysts ignore common sense comparisons of cost and speed. That leads to results akin to arguing that since people are hungry, hunger is urgent, and caviar and rice are both food, therefore both caviar and rice are vital to reducing hunger. Since in reality money and time are both limited, our priorities in feeding people or in providing energy services must be informed by relative cost and by relative speed. Lower cost saves more carbon per dollar. Faster deployment saves more carbon per year. We need both those outcomes. The fraction of journalists and commentators who mention this logic is very close to zero because the nuclear industry is desperately keen that you not hear or understand these points. Now, the economic principle called opportunity cost means that you cannot spend the same money on two different things at the same time. That is, each purchase foregoes other purchases. Buying nuclear power, therefore, displaces buying efficiency and renewables, and vice versa. So nuclear owners strive to beat coal and natural gas, methane gas, while their allies often disparage or suppress renewables. Yet most U.S. nuclear plants are uneconomic just to run, unless that's reversed by subsidy as happened, we'll see. Many of them are closing, so their powerful owners often got, multi-million-dollar bailouts from malleable, or as we just learned in 3 states, corrupt state legislators and from the federal government. But replacing market choices with political log rolling has consequences. It distorts prices, crowds out competitors, slows innovation, reduces transparency, rewards undue influence, introduces bias, picks winners, invites corruption, and even threatens to destroy the competitive regional electricity markets where renewables and efficiency win. Those markets, by the way, are increasingly under attack right now from a supposedly conservative U.S. administration. Now, these are high prices for small or negative benefits. Yet many political leaders of both parties think that climate's urgency demands every option, including preserving nuclear power at any cost. So what is that cost? Well, there have been some indications. First, $15-odd billion spent on operating subsidies, then another $133 billion supporting existing and any new reactors have swamped U.S. market forces. These prodigious new federal grants and financing first bailed out in 2021, as the green bar shows, the roughly 90% of U.S. nuclear plants that were running in the red the year before. And it turned all green, thanks to the taxpayers. Now, a new wave of far larger 2022 subsidies is eliciting implausible schemes to restart decrepit reactors already closed and paying much of the cost to propose new reactors, many of kinds already tried and abandoned decades ago. These nuclear subsidies are very complex and opaque. To help you understand that, Tim Judson at the Nuclear Information and Resource Service prepared this summary of the main terms in the two latest rounds of federal largesse, totaling $149 billion. Some states actually add their own significant subsidies, not shown here. Conversely, on the cost side, the Department of Energy's latest estimate that power from a big U.S. nuclear plant would cost $60 to $100 a megawatt hour is based on serious errors and contradictions. But capital markets aren't biting. They've read Lazard, which says $142 to $232. BNEF, $253 for big or $421 for small reactors. Vodal, actually $445 a megawatt hour. A lot more than 60 to 100. So the United States can only have as many new reactors as taxpayers can be forced to buy because private capital markets won't go there. The only serious nuclear builders nowadays are the Russian and Chinese governments. Global non-China orders are the lowest since 2008. Meanwhile, renewables, nearly all privately funded, are outpacing nuclear power by an order of magnitude in investment worldwide and by 2 orders of magnitude in capacity growth, as we saw. Facts and rhetoric point in opposite directions. I would bet on facts. So, to summarize so far, to displace enough fossil fuel quickly, we need carbon-free power that is cheap and fast. That means renewables and efficiency, not nuclear, whose greater price and lead time worsen climate change. Or if you don't believe in climate change, at least they waste money. Even running existing nuclear plants wastes money that could buy cheaper options, saving even more carbon. More on that in a minute. And the more urgent you think climate change is, the less sense nuclear power makes. These conclusions are intrinsic to all nuclear technologies. A climate non-solution is not worth paying for, let alone paying extra. Nuclear power also offers no benefits for grid reliability or resilience, justifying special treatment. Instead, its inflexibility and ungraceful failures complicate modern grid operations. As we saw last week, traditional so-called baseload generation by big thermal plants is no longer needed nor economic, and the whole concept isn't even useful anymore. Such basic economic comparisons are a topic the nuclear industry normally tries to avoid. The last thing they ever want to talk about is economics. But if a technology cannot come close to competing in actual markets, its other attributes become a lot less important. Now, obviously, dismal economics crimp new nuclear power, but that leaves the big question, what should we do about the existing 410 reactors? Should they keep operating? Many cost more to run than their output can earn, or than it would cost to provide the same services by building and operating new renewables or efficiency. There was a 2019 IEA report dubiously claiming that sustaining the existing nuclear fleet is vital for climate protection, is cost-effective, and merits government support. But it wasn't really a fair comparison based on empirical data and counting opportunity cost. And it really rested on a very opaque model, very complex, full of assumptions that couldn't be drawn out and scrutinized. So instead, let's just examine briefly some current already paid-for reactors' empirical operating competitiveness. I'll just walk you step by step through a 2020 eye chart, now the case is even stronger, about nuclear operating costs, those that need not be paid if the plant does not operate. So the light green zone shows the range of U.S. wholesale real electricity prices from 2003 to 18. The aqua line for green wind power and the gold line for utility-scale photovoltaics show the average fixed prices set in long-term private market power purchase agreements, PPAs. And you can see that the average new wind and solar power by 2018 had fallen to or below the lowest wholesale prices from non-renewables and were trending downward further. So wind power averaged by 2018 under $20 a megawatt hour. It got as low as 11. The included temporary national subsidies to wind and solar, though, turned out hardly to matter. In the lower right corner of the graph, I drew as round dots the comparable unsubsidized prices of wind and solar in Chile, Mexico, and Morocco. The 2019 and 20 winning bids for Portuguese solar and Saudi wind. Of course, now we could add a lot more and better examples from India and the Middle East. The squares show Colorado solar and wind power costs, and the diamonds show cheap electricity storage added on. Okay, now compare with all those empirical competitors, the red line. That is the average operating cost of U.S. nuclear plants, excluding all their original construction costs. And these numbers come straight from the Nuclear Energy Institute, the main lobbying arm. So you can see that the average nuclear operations in red cost more than new modern renewables, with or without their temporary subsidies. Now, the gray and brown horizontal bars show that those average nuclear operating costs by quartile fell as the worst reactors were closed, but renewable prices fell even faster. The later quartile data remained secret, perhaps lest they disturb subsidy appeals. I just discovered today that they have now again started to be published, but leaving out the fourth quartile. That's the one that's not so appealing. Now, it would be hard to cut nuclear operating costs much further than has already happened in reactors averaging over 4 decades old. There's a little bit still to be wrung out, but basically by 2023 it had been. But renewable prices promise decades more of strong further declines. And we've already seen in Lecture 7 how dramatic those are. What about outside the United States? At the far right of this graph, you see international nuclear operating costs, and they tend to be much higher. Troubled fleets like France's and Japan's have to spread their operating costs over less output, and many must buy costly safety and security and life extension upgrades, from which compliant U.S. regulators have largely excused U.S. operators. Meanwhile, efficiency and renewables are taking nuclear power's market away, as we saw earlier for Japan. Now, these operating cost data reveal an important climate opportunity that the nuclear industry hopes you won't discover. The reported operating costs for the costlier to run half of U.S. reactors a few years ago were running about 4 cents a kilowatt hour. The costliest quartile, probably around 5 cents. And the owners got those vast new subsidies to keep running those money-losing plants. Supposedly they have to prove they need the money, but the referee is the Department of Energy, which is a strong promoter. And yet customer efficiency actually costs utilities only an average of 2 or 3 cents per saved kilowatt hour, less if they shop around. And therefore closing a top quartile cost nuclear plant and buying efficiency instead, as owners could volunteer or regulators could require, would save several times as much carbon as continuing to run the nuclear plant. In other words, it may be carbon-free in operation, but it still saves a lot less carbon than if you didn't run it. And some modern renewables could also compete with it. In other words, while we close coal plants to save carbon directly, we should also close distressed nuclear plants and reinvest their large saved operating costs and subsidies in cheaper options to save carbon indirectly. Replacing a closed nuclear plant with efficiency or renewables, we know from when it's happened at state level, only takes 1 to 3 years. Now, if owners don't give such advance notice, perhaps to extort subsidies by making closure more disruptive, more methane gas might temporarily be burned, but then it would be more than offset by the cheaper carbon-free substitutes quickly following. So, with this logic, California's biggest utility agreed to replace its Diablo Canyon reactors with least-cost, carbon-free, competitively procured resources to save money and carbon and help the grid work better. The governor reversed that plan. The legislature may restore it. To get these outcomes, of course, we must track not just carbon, but also money and time. Investing judiciously, not indiscriminately, saves the most carbon per dollar. And if you wonder about carbon per year, I'll spare you a long exchange in Science magazine exposing 7 flaws in a misleading paper. Just recall that in the graph back in lecture 7A, slide 50, renewables clearly grew faster of late than nuclear power ever did back in the 1980s. But hasn't something changed? Enthusiasts claim that substituting various kinds of small modular reactors, SMRs, will achieve competitive costs that last. But that takes magical thinking, and today's reactors are the wrong competitor. Here's why. Early SMRs would produce electricity at well above, probably at least twice, the cost of today's light water reactors, which Lazard found are about 2 to 8 times costlier than modern renewables, or about 5 to 10 times costlier than on-site efficiency. But by the time SMRs, if successful, could begin mass production to capture economies of scale that way, their carbon-free rivals are set to get another twofold cheaper, based on the observed learning curves that nuclear power's never demonstrated. So just do the math. 2 times 2 to 8 times 2 means that mass production must make SMRs about 8 to 32 times cheaper, or Bloomberg's cost figures would give about 24 times. Neither of those ranges is remotely plausible. SMR simply can't catch up because small modular renewables, which do scale down well, have decades head start in exploiting their own formidable economies of scaling and learning. Novel reactor designs and fuel cycles offer no escape because even if the minor nuclear part of the whole prohibitive capital cost of today's reactors were free, the non-nuclear remainder would still be about 2 to 6 times too costly. Nor could SMRs be developed and scaled before the U.S. grid is decarbonized anyway without them. So SMRs would only divert investment, attention, talent, and time from off-the-shelf, popular, benign competing technologies that have already proven rapidly scalable and that win over $1 trillion of private investment each year. Substituting slow, costly SMRs would thus make climate change worse, and it would make proliferation vastly worse. I am astounded and appalled that the Department of Defense is letting the Department of Energy undercut its national security mission by promoting the most proliferative kinds of fuel cycles, things the U.S. just spent decades with its allies trying to prevent. Now, SMRs are off to a rocky start. Électricité de France scrapped its SMR program and is starting over. 3 U.S. flagship startups have stumbled. Bill Gates estimates his proposed Wyoming sodium fast reactor, a type that has failed in all main nuclear nations, could cost $10 billion. Its fuel, like that of many other SMR designs, is unavailable, and it is directly weapons usable. The potential safety of the 83 SMR designs under development worldwide varies. It's often unknown. Wastes are generally similar to those of big reactors, or generally worse. Costs are much higher. The only existing SMRs are a high-temperature helium-cooled plant in China and 2 pressurized water reactors evolved from an icebreaker version sitting on a barge in a remote Russian Arctic port. Those respectively took 9 and 8 years to build. They were costly, and they have lifetime capacity factors around 9% in 2023 and 28% in 2024. So there's no there there. As Doug Parr of Greenpeace put it, Nuclear power can't bridge the gap between anything and anything. It's too slow, it's too expensive, it's a massive distraction. Now, besides the distraction, there is, in my view, an overriding reason not to pursue nuclear power further, even if it could compete. It's the only energy source whose side effects could end civilization abruptly rather than gradually like climate change, and that requires a global safeguards regime. Clearly, that regime is not working. Iran, North Korea. Fortunately, the market collapse of nuclear power, if recognized and permitted, now offers, belatedly, but better late than never, a market-driven opportunity to cut off further proliferation at its root, and probably even roll back some that's now underway. I've been proposing this since the late 1970s, but too far ahead of my time, so nuclear theology has prevailed, hence today's proliferation mess. But might this be an idea whose time has finally come? Let me summarize the argument very briefly in 6 points. Nuclear power makes widely available in innocent civilian disguise all the ingredients of do-it-yourself bomb kits by 20-odd known methods. But if we didn't have nuclear power, that is, if we took economics seriously, then those ingredients would become harder to get, more conspicuous to try to get, and politically much costlier to be caught trying to get or supply, because for the first time the reason for wanting them would be unambiguously military. The civilian disguise would be stripped away. That doesn't mean that getting those ingredients of do-it-yourself bomb kits would be impossible, but it would be a lot more difficult, and it would be easier to detect timely, because it's a lot easier to find needles without the haystacks. So the collapse of commercial nuclear enterprises around the world and the rise of better, cheaper energy alternatives is perhaps the missing link now for effective nonproliferation. And that would also include the opportunity to reinterpret Article 4 of the Nonproliferation Treaty, which gives countries that don't have bombs and don't try to get them an inalienable right to the peaceful uses of atomic energy, which are extremely few and doable in safeguardable ways, things like materials testing and medical isotopes. But you see, Article 4 was written by nuclear experts decades ago when nuclear power was thought indispensable and cheap and safe. And the whole purpose of it was affordable energy for development. So if we return to that purpose, we could say, well, there's a better way to achieve affordable energy for development. We didn't know that when we wrote the treaty, but we sure know it now, and much of the global south is leapfrogging straight to it. So that would be a sensible way to get to the goals that Article 4 was for, and will help everyone do it. And if somebody specifically wants nuclear energy, maybe they need to explain why. So if we strongly acknowledged that nuclear power is not needed, not economic, not helpful, that could go with no longer promoting one of the main causes, perhaps the main cause of proliferation. And that would be a way to improve security and a profit. But of course, the United States cannot be credible in calling for nonproliferation when it is leading the world's nuclear weapon states headlong into a new, extremely expensive, dangerous nuclear arms race. Just as making, having, and using nuclear weapons has become illegal under international law. Reversing that arms race, however, would make everyone safer. It would directly save over $1 trillion. So it's not an irrational thing to ask for, especially if end-use least-cost approaches to security, which I'll describe in a minute, could gain more attention and respect. One little terminological note, some of you have asked about nuclear waste recycling. That's the industry's euphemism for what was long called reprocessing, to chop up and dissolve or otherwise treat spent nuclear fuel to extract unused fissionable isotopes, separate them from fission products and from bomb materials. Now, reprocessing turns out to be an order of magnitude costlier than once through fuel cycles. It's hardly a cycle, it's linear. It makes waste management much harder and costlier. It's enormously more proliferative. It's a really bad idea, and it has no sound need or rationale unless you're making bombs. So the Department of Energy has just abandoned decades of U.S. leadership in stopping reprocessing, again, undercutting its own mission and that of the Department of Defense. Now, where would a rational nuclear policy start, whether it's civilian or military? Here's my modest proposal. It's the exact opposite of where we're heading. First, acknowledging nuclear power's dying of an incurable attack of market forces could open up the important possibility of cheaper solutions and of course, save the enormous subsidies as well. So, with less than 1% market share in adding electric capacity and all of it centrally planned, nuclear power is not going to fulfill its hopes, and we should cut our losses. But alongside that, we need to set a good example in our domestic energy policy, especially in the United States, because if a nation with our wealth and technical skill and fuel resources says we need nuclear power, then any other country can say they need it even more. And I think that sets exactly the opposite of the right example. We don't need to be anti-nuclear to tell the truth about the technology's potential role. We don't need to prohibit it. We just need to stop propping it up and let it die in a quiet and orderly way, humanely. Now, finally, and remarkably, I think without conditions, without discriminations, the United States in particular should help any other country that wants to try the best buys first and might even prefer inherently nonviolent technologies. And that's where the reinterpretation of NPT Article 4 becomes important, that this would advance, not retard, the shared goal of global development and equity. And of course, the other missing piece here is efforts at reducing and reversing the nuclear arms race and creating a different psychological climate where wanting or having reactors or bombs is viewed as a matter for shame rather than a mark of maturity and prestige. Now, as you may gather, I'm very worried that as nuclear power thrashes in its death throes in the marketplace, all perfumed and wrapped in pretty ribbons so you might not notice, dumb U.S. decisions may be about to make the world permanently and vastly more dangerous. And I hope some of you will have a chance to help reverse this major threat to human survival. All we need to do is set a good example, make the case for it, and spread it. It has natural ways to spread because it makes sense and makes money. Now, as I've advised military and national security leaders over decades on energy security, it has gradually dawned on me that the biggest threat to U.S. national security, as conventionally defined, is U.S. energy policy, as most administrations have practiced it. No administration since Jimmy Carter's, and that only in part, has really been consistently sound on these issues. We have, one way or another, encouraged dependence on imported oil, particularly from the Middle East, and funded enemies and funded terrorism indirectly, funded both sides of our oil wars. We have adopted the most vulnerable system architectures, and we haven't yet seen an LNG attack or accident incinerate a city, but we could any time. We have created new prime terrorist targets. LNG is obvious, but just the whole system architecture is an attractive nuisance for attack. And for a long time, the centerpiece of national energy strategy, perhaps now to be attempted to be revived, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, would be an all-American Strait of Hormuz with all the same vulnerabilities. Then there's nuclear power we've just described. And, if these are not the desired security outcomes, I would like to see our military leaders say so. I also think it's time to propose a broader and deeper concept of security itself. And get to the deeper question, what is security? It's not just about war and weaponry. The world's best military, costing Americans over $23,000 per second, does not really make our people secure, because there is no significant military threat to the United States that can be defended against. Because of geography, we're not concerned about armadas of people coming across either ocean in rowboats. There are asymmetric, devastating attacks, such as we've seen, that are undeterrable, though, especially with anonymous or suicidal adversaries. And preventing those by prior intelligence is unreliable and imperfect, as we've learned. The only lastingly effective defense is prevention, chiefly by eliminating conditions that feed and motivate the pathology of hatred. That requires comprehensive, but not indiscriminate, geopolitical and ideological and cultural engagement that goes way beyond traditional military means. It requires, among other things, being a society that others wish to emulate and aspire to be like. But this still doesn't tell us how to achieve the classic definition of security. The definition I like best is freedom from fear of privation or attack. Freedom from fear of privation or attack. So how can we be safe and feel safe in ways that work better and cost less than now? Is there a path to security that's achieved bottom up, not top down? That's the province of every citizen, not the monopoly of national governments. That doesn't rely on the threat or use of violence. that makes others more secure, not less, and advances other overarching goals and maybe even saves enough money to pay for other needs? I think there is. In the late 1980s, I helped Stanford engineer and then RMI security director Hal Harvey, Stanford law graduate Mike Schumann, and Dan Arbus to organize these concepts into the 1993 book you can still get called Security Without War. A close colleague of Secretary Gorbachev told me that the early draft we got to the Secretary was a significant influence in his decision to wind down the Cold War. If that is true, it would be very gratifying. Applying that book's logic to energy and resources could switch from the fragmented, militarized approach to energy and resource security we see on the left to an integrated approach sketched on the right, where we fill in 4 missing links. And if you see that in 3 dimensions as a tetrahedron, an immensely strong structure, it gets even stronger if surrounded by a kernel of justice, which Dr. King taught us is the presence of peace. Now, in that view, security begins with freedom from fear of privation. And clearly this depends on standard foundations for sustainably developing human well-being and potential, and not just for ourselves, but for everyone, for obvious reasons. The UN Sustainable Development Goals now offer a framework for a very similar agenda with a lot of international commitment and momentum. But in order to work, these goals and efforts to achieve them must be universal, not parochial. Far less discussed in the United States is the playbook for becoming free from fear of attack. And it has, I think, 3 interdependent layers. The first is to avoid or prevent conflicts in the first place. That became standard Pentagon doctrine. Stability operations were given the same priority as combat operations, even higher in sensible administrations. Typically, this work was led by the State Department. The ingredients are obvious, including one that we call leader control. That's ways for citizens to find out what their leaders are doing, and if it's foolish or dangerous, tangibly expressing displeasure in a way that can change their incentives and behaviors. The second layer is the rich realm of international laws, norms, and institutions. I needn't amplify that here. The third and most novel layer is the European concept and practice called non-provocative defense, which reliably defeats and deters aggression without threatening others. It has a very wide spectrum, from the Swiss porcupine approach of a rifle in every house and an anti-tank rocket behind every bush, to the late Gene Sharp's civilian-based nonviolent sanctions, which sometimes even defeated the Nazi SS. And nonviolent sanctions were devised by the children of World War II European resistance fighters. They developed systematic nonviolent ways to make their societies inhospitable to invaders who would feel very unwelcome and just want to go home as soon as possible. And military forces, too, can be structured and postured to defend the homeland effectively, but like, say, the Swedish Air Force some years ago, not have enough range to export much offensive capability. In other words, very capable airplanes, but short legs. Or the Swedish coastal artillery, designed so you couldn't elevate it enough to fire beyond territorial waters. Or Swedish military radios, incompatible with both NATO and Warsaw Pact frequencies to ensure neutrality. Now, with Sweden in NATO, that may all have changed, but I want to point out that doctrine worked well for decades. It was very well thought through, well executed. And such design criteria can create mutual defensive superiority, which means that each side's defense is stronger than the other side's offense. Now, everything on this slide appeals to the broad security agendas of some very good U.S. military strategists. For example, there's a lovely YouTube called America's Grand Strategy by retired Marine Colonel Puck Mickleby, Mykleby. Now, returning to that first layer, we can now see that the efficient and restorative use of resources can avoid or prevent conflict in at least 4 ways. It enables just and durable development for everyone, not in opposition to, but in synergy with environmental needs and constraints. Different societies will do it in different ways, but it works across the whole span of scale and diversity. Then, secondly, efficiently using resources, especially if that speeds the spread and extends the reach of benign supplies like renewable energy, can create abundance by design, turning envy into equity, conflict into comedy. I've worked deeply on that approach to oil and water and scarce minerals, and it has a lot of other uses too. Then, third, resilient design reduces incentives for and risks from attacks on long supply chains and brittle infrastructure. It can bring security of supply to all users as a nearly free byproduct of the efficient and clean transition. It's already cheaper than what we've been buying. And finally, as just discussed, a best buys first approach to electricity can help unmask and penalize proliferators of nuclear weapons. And to some degree, similarly for other weapons of mass destruction, like, say, chemical weapons similar to organophosphorus pesticides that can be advantageously displaced by natural systems agriculture. That's a whole other conversation. In short, a good way to avoid ever seeing small stars kindled in or over our cities is to look up now, notice our own neighborhood star, pay attention, accept its daily ample energy gifts, and get to work on building real security in energy and everything else, for all, forever. Let me now turn to the physical asset base, the infrastructure that provides and uses energy. A remarkable 2019 paper inventoried the world's stock the previous year of major devices that emit CO2, power plants, buildings, vehicles, heavy industry. It showed the CO2 emission profile of those assets in these 2 graphs by sector and by location, along with the light shading showing additional emissions from infrastructure proposed and not yet built. About 54% of the total emissions would come from power stations, and they also cause 3/5 of the emissions growth projected for the next 20 years. Well, you can see why in this graph. It reveals the age structure of power plants in the world. Oil and gas plants on the left, coal plants on the right, China in red. So all those young coal plants in China dominate. They peaked about a decade ago, and that was simultaneous with the explosion of Chinese steel and cement capacity, also dominating the world. But all those assets are seriously overbuilt. The coal plants have generally run several percent less each year as renewables outcompete them. Some exceptions, but that's the long trend. China is in the process of adopting economic dispatch, that is running most of the plants with the lowest operating costs, as almost all the West does, with immediate major reductions in costs and emissions. They're expanding state grid power lines and trading to the sun and wind-rich western provinces so they can earn higher prices from customers in the east. And as this doctrine spreads across the whole power sector, it very much disadvantages coal and advantages renewables. Now, operating all these assets at their expected outputs for their expected lifetimes would lock in about 1 2/3 Kelvin of warming all by itself. So we can't do that. The graphs on the left beautifully show how much less CO2 is emitted if the existing infrastructure is run less or is retired early. The graph on the right confirms that of the $20-odd trillion asset value, well over half is in road vehicles, shown in blue. Those are going to retire pretty fast anyway, and they could be scrapped sooner. And only a tenth of the total book value in magenta is the power plants that produce 3/5 of the next 20 years' projected emissions growth. Wow. For the coal plants that by far dominate those emissions, the transition to less operation and early retirement is well underway and accelerating, driven partly by policy and societal demand, especially for clean air, but mostly by basic economics, now starkly evident for Chinese coal power. The Paris Agreement's 1.5 Kelvin aspirational goal for limiting global warming would require 80% of 2010 coal-fired electricity generation to stop by 2050. That means closing one plant per day to 2040 and essentially all of them by 2050. But now this would actually be profitable. This important 2020 study that RMI collaborated in looked at coal-fired electricity's imploding economics for 2,500 coal plants, 95% of the global fleet. It found that 39% of that coal capacity cost more to run in 2020 than building and running new renewables, including battery storage. That 39 was expected to rise to 60% in 2022, 73% in 2025, even faster in China and India. I don't have an exact update of this study, but I think it's pretty much what happened. Many coal plants' operating costs are becoming so uncompetitive that closing and replacing them back in 2020 with modern renewables, including battery storage if you think you need it, would be cost neutral in 2 years and would save over $100 billion a year by 2025. So continuing to run those coal plants is wasting vast amounts of money. The challenge is that 93% of the coal plant's operating cost is not instantly variable. It's in long-term contracts and tariffs that insulate coal for some period from clean competition. That's why we've seen a big set over recent years of U.S. coal phase-out deals, internationally supported. And emulating those lets those legacy tariffs and contracts and plants get replaced by smart plant refinancing that recompenses investors, reinvests in clean replacements, cuts customers' bills, and provides a just transition for workers and for host communities. And that vital social outcome is geographically concentrated, but it's not terribly costly. For example, the United States has about half as many coal miners as it has yoga instructors, both important occupations. The just transition that the miners deserve is very affordable. Indeed, Germany is shutting down its coal plants, as we saw, and it's already ceased mining hard coal without putting any coal miners out of work. Okay, now recall from 7A, slides 85 to 87, the serious defects in the climate choice models that now drive global policy. Most models do not compete or compare end-use efficiency with supply, or include integrative design, or use empirical renewable costs or their accelerated learning rates, or let renewables keep learning inside the model the way they do in markets, or fully exploit flexawatts, or count distributed generation, or include EV integration and thermal storage, or use the so-called superpower thesis of Tony Seba and Adam Dorr. And I should explain what that is. People in the electricity tribe tend to say, well, to go to all renewables, we're going to need a whole bunch of extra renewables to cope with difficult weather. That's true, and it's cheap enough that you can do it. Meanwhile, the mobility and industrial sectors tend to say we're going to need a whole lot of new solar and wind generation to make the process heat and hydrogen and ammonia and so on to get our sectors electrified and off fossil fuels. But very often the solar and wind capacity both these tribes are calling for is the same capacity counted twice. That is, the extra capacity you build for reliability and bad weather for the power system most of the time doesn't have to run for that purpose because the weather isn't that bad, and therefore you can use that capacity to decarbonize the other sectors without having to build it all over again. So that's what they call superpower. Well, fixing these 10 apparent basic flaws could reverse the supposed cost, slowness, and difficulty of all renewable power and of the whole energy transition. I wonder which modelers are going to be the first ones to get these fundamentals right. Boy, that sounds like a promising dissertation topic. Well, slides 7A, 86 to 88, and 7B, 38 illustrate the power of combining just a few of these 10 classes of grid and system balancing solutions. Several of them, starting with strong end-use efficiency, are so important that they can probably swing the whole result by themselves. And that's what we found in these Oxford findings that you saw in 7A 88, which global markets are now validating. Bloomberg New Energy Finance raised its forecast of photovoltaic additions in 2023 from 270 to 390 gigawatts during about a year while they were happening. In other words, they were whizzing by so fast, the analysts couldn't keep up, and they couldn't see a clear enough image of what was happening. It was just a blur. In 2024, those additions of photovoltaics soared to almost 600 gigawatts. Solar operating costs also fell 90% in the past decade. They keep falling every year. Professor Mark Jacobson at Stanford estimates that to replace all fossil fuels worldwide would take about a $62 trillion investment, or about the same as McKinsey proposes for hydrocarbon investment. But the renewables strategy would save $11 trillion per year. That's an 18% return on investment, or a simple payback under 6 years, plus any avoided harms. It's like Bloomberg's calculation that they say the net zero scenario would take 19% more investment than the base case scenario, but that doesn't count the avoided fuel costs. You have to read the fine print in these studies. And none of these comparisons counts most of the efficiency resource, or virtually any from integrative design. So since efficiency is half the historic and at least half the prospective solution, greatly underscoping efficiency makes the solution look a lot harder than it needs to be. Let me wrap up with a big picture of how the energy disruption now underway has sparked a huge reallocation of financial capital, as described in your reading on capital flight. Feeling the threat from every sector's demand and supply-side competition, incumbent energy suppliers understandably focus on the need for price to exceed cost. But many seem to forget the other part of the business condition, that value must exceed price. If competitors offer a superior value proposition and run off with your revenues, it doesn't matter if you can profitably sell what your ex-customers are no longer buying. These energy transformations can flip markets with breathtaking speed. On Fifth Avenue in New York in 1900, you have to look hard for the first car. Anyone see it? Just 13 years later, you have to look even harder for the last horse. The horse and buggy industry thought it had many decades to adapt, but Ford's Model T car got 62% cheaper in 13 years. Car-owning households soared from 8 to about 60% in a decade. 3/4 financed by a GM and DuPont innovation called car loans. Today's solar modules just got 80% cheaper in 5 years, 50% cheaper in half a year. Batteries just got 89% cheaper in 10 years. Lithium iron phosphate, 50% more or less cheaper in half a year. 3/4 of our rooftop solar is innovatively financed. Basically, Ford's and Edison's industries are merging or converging to eat Rockefeller's industry. The horse and buggy thinking is dangerous, but it's still common. As the late ex-oilman Murray Strong said, not all the fossils are in the fuel. But DuPont's ex-chairman Edgar Woolard reminds us that firms hampered by old thinking, he said, won't be a problem because they simply won't be around long term. Thus, the pace of transformation is set not by incumbents but by insurgents. They're not inhibited by incumbents' business models or legacy assets or cultures. And now, accelerating capital flight from fossil fuels is greatly speeding these competitive trends. In 2021, renewable investments exceeded the total capital flows to oil and gas exploration. In 2023, just solar investments did that. So capital is fleeing from hydrocarbons to renewables as many investors try to avoid the rush and crowd through the exits all at once. Now, Carbon Tracker, then RMI, then Ember investment analyst Kingsmill Bond, nicely explains the brutal logic of the capital markets. He says, any fast-growing challenger will rapidly take all the growth in a slow-growing market. As a rule of thumb, incumbent sales will peak when the challenger gets to around 3% market share, as in these examples. Huh? That's awfully early. Why is it so soon? Well, because most investors seek growth, not mere size, and they try to sell out just before sales peak and stagnation strands assets and competition drops prices. That's why the coal industry lost 3/4 of its world market value, 99% of its U.S. market value, but now this collapsing value is starting to spread to oil and gas. Peak nuclear power output, coal use, auto sales, and fossil power already happened. Fueled auto sales have been shrinking ever since 2017 because electric cars took more than all of the growth. They just blew away the forecast. IEA says the pandemic slump in 2020 undid the previous 4 years of global energy growth and 9 years of CO2 growth. But meanwhile, renewables grew 45% faster, adding 278 gigawatts of capacity in 2020, 290 the next year. In 2024, renewables, again, outdid themselves. Let's see, 599 plus 131, that's 730 gigawatts. And corporate power purchase agreements, almost all renewable, totaled 62 gigawatts. So by the time and to the extent demand recovers somewhat, renewables will probably have expanded enough to supply about any future growth, and that tips fossil fuels into permanent decline. Therefore, peak oil, peak fossil fuels, peak CO2 emissions all happened during about 2019 to 25, with fluctuations still of a few percent due to weather or war or Chinese industrial policy along this bumpy plateau as those declines begin right around 2025. A couple of examples. All three of Bloomberg's 2021 supply scenarios, renewable, prolonged fossil, and in red, exuberantly and exorbitantly nuclear on the right, now show peak fossil fuel use in 2019. In this new world, investors rapidly shift their capital to renewables and efficiency. Efficient use makes renewables gain share faster. Efficiency outcompetes fossil fuels sooner. Renewables and efficiency strongly reinforce each other. Well, that was 2021. By mid-24, Bloomberg scenarios still show peak coal in 2023. Peak oil a little later, 2028 or 9. A local peak in gas, 2023 to 5, followed by a long-term decline and then a resurgence, mostly for the power sector, which by then is nearly half renewable but could be much more. They take a rather restrictive view of grid integration. So their base case economic transition scenario on the left is driven by relative cost and technology trends on the supply side, but it includes only quite meager efficiency gains that provide 12% of the halving of carbon emissions. Just based on energy GDP intensity projections, there isn't really a serious analysis. Electrification provides a further 15% of that halving of emissions. Clean power, almost all solar and wind, is the other 68%. So the result is just 27% lower emissions by 2050 than if we didn't improve anything. That's consistent with a catastrophic 2.6 Kelvin of global warming. An alternative scenario called net zero, the dashed line on the right, cuts emissions 3 times as fast, but it still ends up at a dangerous 1.75 Kelvin of warming. Bloomberg's analysis of renewables is, as usual, convincing and thorough, of grid integration, unduly constrained, and of efficiency, sketchy. Analyzing efficiency, including integrative design, as well as they analyze renewables, would give Bloomberg a far stronger, more helpful result. I hope we can help with that. However, it is encouraging that peak emissions have probably already happened. Now we just need to drive them down a lot faster. Here's one thing that helps. The continued capital flight from fossil fuels to renewables is logical because as of, say, mid-21, renewable portfolios in the financial world were yielding higher returns than portfolios of fossil fuel suppliers. They were also less volatile, and they were less correlated with the general market, so they helped diversify investment risk. These results held in all markets examined by this joint IEA and Imperial College London study, but the performance spread favoring renewables was widest in advanced economies and in China. Let me return to scenarios for a minute. Here's an especially simple and clear graph to help you further to visualize the global energy transition. The bottom 3 wedges, coal in black, oil in red, gas in gray, were stagnating even before the 2020 pandemic. Its economic shock shriveled fossil fuels for a bit, but as they started to recover, renewables up at the top, mainly wind in aqua, solar in yellow, grew even faster and grabbed the capital. Total energy use may still rise a bit to the late 2030s, but starting right around now, say 2024 to 28, renewables should probably supply all the growth, if not more. Again, turning fossil fuels from a growth engine into a sunset industry. And that prospect is eroding fossil fuel companies' long-term value and their political clout. Still immense, but visibly starting to wane. By late 2020, renewable firms' U.S. market value rose 80% in the year, while hydrocarbon firms lost 50%. In 2012, 4 of the top 10 global firms were oil companies. In 2021, I wonder how many were? 0. Usually none made the top 20 firms. This wartime profit spurt lately may be their last hurrah before reality sets in. And given current politics, hydrocarbon leaders should reflect on Ken Boulding's law of political irony. Ken, a great British economist in Boulder, said, whatever you do to try to help people or firms hurts them, and vice versa. In autumn 2020, ExxonMobil became temporarily worth less than a renewable-centric Florida utility holding company called NextEra Energy. If you'd invested in NextEra a decade before, you would have returned 600%, including dividends. ExxonMobil would have returned negative 25%. In autumn 21, sudden fuel shortages spiked prices and gave firms like Exxon lots of cash, but much of it had to go straight back to their shareholders to try to keep them on board. And high prices will not revive oil demand. The new U.S. administration will doubtless shower hydrocarbon firms with abundant resource access, but that won't provide the 2 main things they lack: demand and profits. Moreover, capital flight is self-reinforcing. Within portfolios, disinvestment in fossil fuels gets reallocated mainly to fast-growing competitors in or related to the energy sector, like renewables, efficiency, storage, energy service companies, ride-sharing firms. Their success directly speeds fossil fuels' decline. So Apple was recently worth more than the top 16 hydrocarbon companies combined. Tesla is worth more than all the world's significant automakers combined. Capital flight also weakens incumbents' recruitment and retention of talent. It makes them pay more for capital. It reduces the political power that long helped them protect their subsidies and block new competitors. Those trends, in turn, all speed fossil fuels' delegitimization and decapitalization, although spiking influence can temporarily mask long-term trends. Kingdom L. Bond explained that capital flight is triggered by a fast-growing competitor in a slow-growing market. What's that? Well, growth in global primary energy demand is the rate of GDP growth minus the rate of improving energy intensity. And that small difference between two small numbers has slowed by 2/5 in the past quarter century. But long-term carbon emissions are exquisitely sensitive to that small difference, and hence to the speed of saving energy, no matter what GDP does. So further speeding energy savings could avoid enormous carbon emissions by speeding capital flight from incumbents to insurgents. How can we exploit this sensitive intervention point by deeper, cheaper energy savings implemented even faster? Well, maybe greater speed could come from integrative design, because its contagious ideas, transmissible often by hearing a phrase or seeing a photo, could spread at the speed of social media, perhaps even rivaling the speed of scaling solar power. There isn't literature I can find comparing the potential speed of spreading viral ideas versus scaling hardware, but the same attributes that make solar power scale quickly also seem applicable to integrative design. And another big speed boost may be coming from governments focusing remaining pandemic relief funds to build back better with new green industries rather than bailing out failing ones. The U.S. at first did the opposite and still lags a bit, but it began catching up in 2022 with new laws. And Europe is advantageously getting it right pretty consistently. So this tragic pandemic may have helped to birth a pivotal opportunity to speed energy savings and to speed the self-reinforcing shift of capital from dirty to clean. As these sheep and goats divide, as great business empires fall and rise, which of the great companies on the left will be brave enough and move fast enough to make that perilous crossing and join the firms on the right? Which category will you encourage their owners and leaders to choose? What ideas and memes and tools will you help create to propel this transition even faster? Capital markets, I think, have not yet priced in the far greater energy savings achievable with integrative design as summarized here, over twice what's conventionally assumed, nor its potential to spread more quickly via viral memes and images. So as this idea spreads outward from our little black swan hatchery, I'm hatching a little plot for the nonviolent overthrow of bad engineering, to put it a trifle impolitely, and this course is its cornerstone. Observing buildings and vehicles and factories in 70-odd countries for 50-odd years, I see all the same design errors everywhere because they're widespread, in common practice, and in our textbooks and classrooms. If we don't fix that, we're condemning our successors to perpetual retrofit of inefficient stuff. Not a worthy legacy, and they'll have a lot of other things to worry about. So, trying to be a better ancestor, I am seeking fellow students, teachers, practitioners who want to keep improving integrative design's content, stories, methods, transmissibility, and intellectual virulence so they can quickly take over the world. I'd like to build an army of champions for better engineering, help retread in practice design professionals, and also, importantly, the trade people like pipe fitters and mechanical contractors who informally design many systems. I want to help writers of design software improve their tools to make better easy, and find iconic CEOs to apply this work in their firms and to spread their work to their peers, scaling what we might call 5 Eta, much the way Jack Welch spread 6 Sigma to his golfing buddies. In short, I aim to launch and scale an irresistible movement to make integrative design normal and spread it everywhere. Let's roll.